Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode on Laid Back the Atirozinga podcast. And our topic for this week is cancer research and disparities. Our guest for this week is Dr. Zeribe and Nwosu, who is an assistant professor in molecular biology and genetics at Cornell University in the United States. Dr. Zeribe's research is focused on cancer metabolism and therapy. So he's trying to understand the metabolic alterations in cells that actually promote cancer growth and progression. Hello, Dr. Zeribe. Welcome to the show.
Hello, Arinze. Nice to meet you again. Thank you very
Yeah,
much for hosting me.
thank you. It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. But we'll start off by asking what I ask every other guest on the podcast. So let me start by asking you this. Is this your very first podcast?
Yes, absolutely. This is my very first podcast. And in fact, probably my very first such engagement in, let's say, media outside seminars. For example, I've never talked to anyone on radio before, never talked to anyone on
Uh,
television before, and I like to do these stuff.
interesting. So since this is your first time on something away from seminar, what are your expectations on the podcast today?
Well, I expect it to go smoothly, similar to seminars, but there's an aspect of me that is a little bit nervous.
You don't have to be. Don't relax. You don't have to be. Even though we are going to talk about something serious, it's in a very laid back and relaxed manner, so you don't have to be.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, of course, I am aware of that, but I'm just saying that there's an aspect of me. It's a little aspect, but enough. I just have to acknowledge that it's there.
Yeah, fine. Okay, but let's start off by actually talking about your career, your journey so far. Could you tell us about your journey and how you eventually got into cancer research?
Well, that's a long journey, a long story. If you want to hear the full gist of it, then we probably will not finish this podcast today. But I'll give you the small, short version of it.
Yeah,
As you know, we both met at Ebonyi State University. I studied medical lab science at Ebonyi State University. And
yeah,
then from that point, I went to England through the Niger Data Development Commission scholarship to do my master's in biomedical science at London Metropolitan University. And I think that's where I became interested in cancer research. Originally, I was interested actually in cardiovascular disease, and I was hoping that I was going to go on to do some serious work on atherosclerosis for
yeah.
some family reasons. But anyway, eventually, I went on to do my PhD in Heidelberg in the lab of Professor Stephen Dooley, where I studied metabolism in liver cancer. And then I finished in 2017 and transitioned to the US a year after for my postdoc. Then from
Oh,
that point, I came to Cornell.
oh, nice. That's a very that's a very good journey from cardiovascular disease now to cancer. But you did mention now that doing your PhD in Germany, you focused on liver cancer. So what type of cancer are you majorly focused on right now and why?
Yes, I realized that I missed a bit of that in this trying to butcher the
Yeah,
trajectory.
yeah,
So after my PhD, I moved to Michigan, University of Michigan, in the labs of Dr. Kostas Lysiotis and Marina Pasca Di Magdano, and
okay,
we started to study pancreatic cancer. It was a bit of a transition for me, going
yeah,
from liver cancer. But at some point, I realized that I was quite interested in the metabolism aspect, and that I would have still been able to apply that to any cancer setting, regardless. So
yeah,
yes, I studied pancreatic cancer in Michigan, and now the laboratory is focusing mainly on pancreatic cancer, although there's an aspect of me that also wants to kind of go back to liver cancer to study some concepts. And one aspect that we think is quite interesting to look at in liver cancer now is the metabolic drivers of pancreatic cancer metastasis to the liver,
yeah,
because we know that the liver is one of the sites where pancreatic cancer cells metastasize to.
yeah.
So
Okay. So you've mentioned so much now about the metabolism or the metabolic nature of these cancer cells. Why is it so important for us to understand their metabolic nature?
well, I think I look at metabolism in cancer from a very simple model of, just think about us as human beings. For us to grow, we have to feed, right?
Yeah.
And so if you look at it in a much more smaller scale, that's exactly what cancer cells need to do to grow. They develop, Then they have to feed, and based on their nutritional access, they can thrive, and ultimately the space becomes constraining to them. They want to break out of that space, and then they metastasize, right?
Yeah.
Of course, it's not as simple as I just said it, but on a broader concept, that's exactly what has to happen. No cell, no tissue can ever grow without nutrients. There is no other way. And
Yeah.
so, for us in the metabolism space, it is very important to understand those nutrients that are critical for cancer growth, the molecular pathways that enable the cancer cells to use those nutrients, and then ultimately you can think of a way to disrupt those pathways towards therapy. For me, this is a very simple concept, and I think I always believe that the best science should be simple.
True. 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 Um. So that means cancer research is really, really important. But it, since we've been talking about the metabolism now, since the cancer cells need nutrients to grow, just like normal cells. But in the context of the non-scientific audience out there who end up listening to this podcast, why do you think cancer research is actually really important, and why do we need like more Black people to get into cancer research and therapy?
Well, I'll start with the first one, why cancer research is important.
Yeah.
I mean, we as human beings are being plagued by so many diseases, and so we really cannot sit back and watch, because that is going to be a disservice to ourselves and also a disservice to generations to come. So we have to make efforts to try to understand what drives these cancers, how do they develop, and at what point do they actually even take off, like become much more progressive, and how can we detect them and how can we treat them? This is a very critical, I would say, existential question. We really have to ask this question to be able to enable and sustain our existence as human beings. And also, it allows us, in my perspective, to be more mindful of those things that could potentially induce cancer. And so, I think that without sustaining efforts towards cancer research, we risk probably more serious complications too. Of course, some of these cancers also come with other side effects, or I wouldn't say side effects. Side effects is more with treatment, but they come with other comorbidities.
Yeah.
And you could have a situation where somebody has cancer, and then this then complicates to other situations like heart failure,
Yeah.
etc. Right? And so ultimately, you are dealing with one thing that could actually have multiple dimensions, all of which are not favorable to us as humans. So we just
Yeah.
cannot watch. And then the other question you asked is about why blacks should get into cancer.
Yeah.
Well, I think that um, you know I know that some aspect of your question is going to be about disparity.
Yeah.
Disparity, the concept of disparity, which I'm not an expert on, so to say, just looks at the potential that you may have distinct molecular alterations depending on which population you are looking at, right?
Yeah.
And if you are seeing distinct molecular alterations in cancer, we know for sure that also could predict distinct therapeutic responses. And so it becomes important that we have, people from both sides contributing to the understanding of cancer. And
Yeah.
and there's an aspect of it that I believe is less emphasized sometimes, especially not for us that are more in the molecular biology aspect. We just think about the molecular. But if you look
Side
at it
effect.
at the
Yeah.
more human interaction level, you would imagine that if a black person is, let's say, a doctor attending to patients, that there are some patients. I'm saying some patients might prefer to might prefer to go to that particular person for treatment, right?
Mm.
And for such individuals, if they are not provided that opportunity, then that is also a lost opportunity to better understand potentially a unique subset of cancer that could again enhance our ability to treat this disease. So, in my perspective, every race, every people of different orientations should be represented in every spectrum of our understanding of cancer, or
Yeah.
of our effort to understand cancer.
Yeah. Hmm. Interesting. I actually agree with what you say, because cancer affects people of all ages and races. It doesn't really matter whether you are black, white, or Asian. It does not matter. It can actually affect anybody.
Yes.
But there's something I read somewhere, and I realized that Black, African, and Caribbean people, like they are more likely to be diagnosed at an advanced stage and have higher death rate than all the other racial and ethnic groups. Why do you think that's the case?
I mean, that's I wouldn't dispute the uh, probability that you just put forward.
Yeah,
But I think that, supposing that is, I'm just going to, let's say, make a hypothesis here. Supposing that your your statement is correct. In other words, supposing that it's something that is applicable across board, because it could be correct in a subset, or from the
yeah,
perspective of the person who wrote the article you referred
right,
to, but it may not be true if it is applied across board. But supposing it is true across board, then we have to think about social determinants,
yeah,
also social factors. Who has more access to hospital infrastructure? Who has the more resources to be able to take advantage of some of the treatments out, some of the most advanced and probably more expensive treatments out there for various cancers, and who has more access to the diagnostic resources
yeah,
that could predict and detect cancer very early on. And what is the general attitude of people of different backgrounds to access to hospital care, and also screening programs? And let me say something in perspective. Um, I- so even though I personally, and this is probably not a good thing to say, but it is a fact, and I just have to say it that way. So even though I trained in the hospital, I studied medical lab science, and as
yeah,
you know, if we're talking about anybody, any set of professionals involved in diagnostics in some sense, we are the people.
yeah,
But during my time as a medical lab scientist in practice, I rarely, very rarely said to myself, "Oh, let me just test my blood for blood glucose and all these basic parameters." I
yeah,
never did that. So there's an aspect of me uh, that just thought that, oh, what are you going to see? And when you see this thing, what are you going to do next? you know and it's a no it's I'm just giving that as an example for somebody who is already trained at that level, and somebody who had the resources and was really doing the test for other patients,
yeah,
right? It was difficult for me to do that for myself, and I
yeah,
would have done that for myself free of charge. So it
yeah,
is not even the cost. Now, using that as an example, it's not even the cost. It is also a societal potential mindset and cultural issue, right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
perspective that may collectively influence how some persons go for routine checkup
yeah,
more than others. Let me give you another example. Again, that is not so nice, but it is a fact. I've had, for example, this what do you call it? Dental insurance. I have had dental insurance all of my time in Europe, and all my time here in some sense. I have never gone to a dentist. So,
Why?
yeah, I've never gone to a dentist to show my teeth for anything. And those are again things that, because it was not the way I was brought up, it was not a culture that was inculcated in me that in every year you should go for dental checkup
For
or
checkup? Yeah,
something like that. I'm not doing it, and it is true that this can also apply to how people tend to react or tend to respond to calls for routine screening about cancer. And yes, I also worry that ultimately there are so many people who are really having serious problems, but they don't know, because they don't take this kind of call seriously until it gets too late.
yeah. Interesting. What you said is actually very interesting because, um, like here in the UK, for example, you will have a lot of cancer screening programs. All right.
Mhm.
Um, but still, I look at and I talk to people within my own community, within my own Black African community, and I start questioning the health seeking behavior, and then our outlook on things like diseases like cancer. Sometimes, do you think some people see talking about things seeking um um medical care and all these things? Do you see sometimes people see talking about cancer like as a taboo in our community, in the Black community? Because sometimes I feel like some people are so scared to even talk about it.
Yes, yes. I mean, I believe that that is true. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, I saw an article on the BBC just a couple of days ago, either BBC or CNN. I get some, I'm not entirely sure because I look at those major networks, and I'm just referencing that. Not that they pay me to promote them, but I use those two networks very frequently. But there was an article that was referring to, I believe, people from some part of Asia, complaining about the stigma they likely face when they find that they have a certain kind of cancer,
Yeah,
or the stigma that they feel that the society likely uh, have towards them, uh, the prejudice that society have towards them because they have cancer. And so there is a likelihood that uh, some people may feel, again, due to environment and culture where people have come from, some people may feel that, oh, making it known that I have this sort of disease may create a certain kind of bias
yeah,
against me. And that is exactly the point that many advocacy groups are making now, to say, we should fight also not just the science, the cancer from the scientific front, but also from the perspective of stigmatization, or rather, we should invest more effort in supporting people who find themselves in this situation, and also in giving them that sense of hope and the sense of belonging. So
yeah.
yes, I believe that there is already evidence that some people may be having that sense of stigmatization when they may feel that they will be stigmatized against when they announce that they have cancer.
Cancer.
But
Yeah,
I believe also that there are some very high profile people that have come up, in public and announced that they have cancer, and even turn that for to something towards maybe raising fund and supporting others who may have that disease but may not be able to speak up for themselves. And so, yes, there is definitely elements of that bias thing there, but I hope that we are also making progress. When I say we, I mean those who work on that front are also making progress in fighting against it.
mm, okay. That it, to make more progress, right, in fighting against cancer. Do you do you think if we take this message, right, like if we take the message directly to these communities, um, for example, you mentioned the Asian cancer patients and what they face. Do you think if we take the message directly to the Black community or the Black and Asian community, for example, do you think it will help people to actually it will improve the cancer screening uptake and actually help people to at least remove that stigma so that people can actually seek help on time?
Well, I mean, we can take message to anywhere. You can take message to the moon, to tell people about problems and potential solutions. But if you don't provide them the resources to be able to assess that solution, people will still hear that and resort to whatever they are used to doing, right?
Yeah,
Let us say, for example, you and I may have come from very rural parts of Nigeria,
yeah,
some sense. I want to imagine my own village, and you go to somebody in my village and tell them that they have cancer, that they should go to a hospital, and they ask you how much is it to transportation. We're not talking about treatment. Transportation from where they are to where they will access hospital care. You mentioned the amount. They'll just tell you they can't do it.
yeah.
They
True.
can't do it. So it's not a message per se. although the message is extremely important, in my perspective, what is more important is to make the healthcare facilities accessible to people, especially people in rural areas. And that's
Yeah.
the first point. Make it accessible in terms of, first of all, let there be a healthcare facility, and then secondly, let it be affordable,
Yeah.
right? And then all these campaigns and advocacy initiatives will have more traction. But if you don't have the resources for people to take advantage of it in an affordable manner, the messages will be interesting, and they always have been, but people will not respond.
Mm. Interesting. That's an interesting outlook. Yeah, because I think the most important thing is taking the message to them, but the accessibility should be there as well, and make it affordable for the patients as well. But since there are so many things involved that can actually help in improving cancer treatment for this demographic that we're looking at right now, do you think if we end up understanding the different genetic factors or mutation status in this particular demographic, that it can actually help to improve or develop cancer treatments for them?
Yes, I mean, once we're able to find a let's say specific molecular signatures that could predict therapeutic response in one effectively that could effectively predict therapeutic response in one cancer setting, and let's say in one cancer population. And as somebody personally, I do a lot of bioinformatics in my work. I actually love to combine bioinformatics with experimental validation. And so I have always believed that it will be possible to predict many more things once we just have a handful of very, very robust signatures that lead us in the right direction. And
Yeah.
so that's why if you check most of my work, you will see there's always some sort of attempt to make some prediction and to try to kind of follow up on that. So
Mm.
we will not have, and maybe not immediately, the resources to, when I say we, I mean the entire cancer research community, regardless of where they are located. We not have the resource to, let's say, sequence and to molecularly profile all of the cancers that exist in all of their different variants. I mean, there are different very high profile initiatives here in the US to do that, and also in the UK at least, and many countries in Europe, to be fair, to do that. But it will not be sufficient to learn so much to be able to, let's say, have broad-based approach that works for everybody. And so my thinking is that a lot of the things that we could eventually use in resource limited places, or places, let's say, where efforts towards understanding cancer has been less so far, a lot of the let's say translational outputs, including therapies that could eventually be used for those patients, we have to come from predictions
Yeah.
from what has been done in other places where resources are already there and there has been massive molecular profiling available. So that's just the way we will have to go. But that being said, there is still a need for work to continue. At the very minimum, sample collections should continue in the more rural places. There should be appropriate documentation, biobanking. Those should continue so that when we now reach that point where we feel like we have learned so much, we can begin to look at those tumors that we have collected in the more rural areas or resource limited areas at this point in time, and then to see if they reflect those portraits that we've seen in more developed countries. And if they reflect those portraits, then we can begin to predict that maybe what is now working for this patient, these sort of people in this part of the world, could also potentially work for these patients who express this signature in the more rural or resource limited areas. So this is my thinking of how cancer research is likely to ultimately benefit everybody.
Mm. Interesting. Um, mm, that's really really interesting. But I know we've mentioned we just talked about it, the molecular profiles and signatures. But if we increase What do you think about increasing diversity in the clinical trials as well?
Well, yeah, of course, diversity in clinical trials is very, very important. But there is an aspect of I think it's something that must be done for sure. But you need to think about how these clinical trials are, formulated versus how many people participate in each of these trials, right? And
Yeah.
to be able to get a broader sense of whether uh, either of those strategies will be effective or not. And again, I believe that diversity is very critical. But if we have a clinical trial now, just let me give this hypothetical example, which is not probably not far from the reality in some instances. If we have a clinical trial in which 50 people are participating in it, and in that 50 people participating in that trial, you have two from, let me say country. I don't want to mention country. Let's say you have two from country A, and you have five from country B, and you have one from country C. And then it goes on and on. Do you really believe? This is the question. Do you
Yeah.
really believe? And not a question you should answer. Do you
Yeah.
really believe that we will be able to learn anything that could be very specific to somebody from country C that is contributing one patient, or
Yeah.
country A that contributed two patients? Maybe we will, but the problem is that, and I've spent a lot of time analyzing gene expression profiles in cancer, and I'm not even talking about other cancers, just liver cancer and pancreatic cancer to a large extent, maybe a handful of others. And I can tell you that it is, in some instances, very difficult to pin down specific patterns in a cohort of one particular cancer, and so you have such a diversity that is likely being contributed to by the age of the patient, contributed to by potential comorbidities, some other diseases that these patients may have, may contributed to whether they have received certain treatments or not, and of course, as somebody who is studying metabolism, contributed to by diet, different dietary patterns, etc., etc. And so it is so heterogeneous, even within one patient, that it is very difficult, really, to see how, for example, in the hypothetical example that I gave you, how such diversity is actually helpful.
Yeah.
In my perspective, in that context, it is less likely to be productive because you are also really dealing with diversity within diversity, and the sample size is too small to allow you to be able to make anything meaningful. But yet, this may also be a rare cancer in which such a clinical trial is extremely necessary, just to at least get any kind of clue that might benefit one or two patients. And so, my perspective on that, and again, with all due respect to the difficulties in assessing some certain patients, and for assembling this clinical trial in the first place, my perspective is that clinical trials that are likely to lead to very substantial leap in our understanding of cancer, we have to be very massive in scale, and I don't want to put a number on it because I really very much acknowledge and respect the effort of those who are doing these clinical trials, and of course the difficulties in assessing patients. But again, realistically, it will have to be very massive in scale for the concept of trying to accomplish diversity just for the sake of it, including one or two persons from one or two geographies or so, for that to make sense.
Hmm. Interesting. That's
Just
yeah.
let me continue that a little bit.
Yeah.
Otherwise, because I think it's very important to clarify it and to add some flesh to that. Otherwise, we go back to what I said earlier on. What may be the best option will be a situation where, diversity should be there, but it should not be for the sake of having it, and then we end up with one or two patients coming from different regions. But where we sort of enrich a certain population, maybe two or three or four populations or so in that clinical trial, and then hope that we can derive specific molecular signatures from those patients who responded, for example, and then use that to kind of walk back and go to populations that may not be represented. And then we can actually even think more towards individualization of this therapeutic intervention later on, where we could say, oh, we found that we compared two populations, 25, 25, and this 25 responded to this treatment. And we found that this 25 expresses gene X, or a suite of signatures. And
Yeah.
then we take those suite of signatures, and when we find the next patient from a region that is very less represented, that couldn't have been sufficient to get into the clinical trial, we test that particular patient. And if this patient is expressing the signature from the cohort that were responsive, then we can begin to believe that there's a likelihood that this patient will respond. I think that is how we could learn from clinical trial. And I think, of course, that's how it works, except that we should not diversify it for the purpose of just, ticking that box.
Interesting. Yeah, I agree with that. We shouldn't just do it because we just want to tick the diversity box. But if we can actually make sure we have like a large sample size to understand to understand the molecular profiles and signatures in different ethnic groups, that would actually help. Yeah. But you what about cancer and how it affects the family in general? Because I've seen I've read in some papers that cancer can actually affect well-being and fertility of a couple. So look at that in a general context. How do you think cancer affects families within this Black community?
Oh, well, I mean, if you said affect families, it has different dimensions, as you mentioned. And the fertility aspect, maybe I have no expertise to comment on that
Yeah.
in a broader, or let's say in a specific sense, and probably even in a broader sense. But what I can say for sure is, if let's say again a hypothetical scenario where you have parents and a moderate family of two children. We come from Africa. We don't always have moderate family. You always have the family like 6 people or five, like massive number of people. But anyway, you can imagine how, let's say, um, if and again going back to where we came from, where the parents are oftentimes, if not always, the people sustaining the family, the two individuals sustaining the family, providing the resource, and all the children just literally just depend on what they are being given by their parents. You can imagine a situation where that resource is now being diverted
Yeah.
towards the treatment of either of the parents for a condition like cancer. And in some instances, as we know in our country, it may even, which is Nigeria, just in case people in the audience may be wondering, because I'm not sure if it was mentioned. Yeah,
Yeah.
it may involve flying that person abroad for certain kind of additional treatment. Then we think about the cost implication. You think that in some instances, actually would mean that the children would have to stop going to school. There is no other alternative. They would have to stop because the resources to be used to save daddy or mommy, and without that, how would we get money to continue, right? And so you can imagine how that then sets back these students in terms of their career, in their and also in terms of their growth and also their psychology too. At a very young age, they begin to bear this huge responsibility of taking care of the parents' health and all of that. And I think that there's a cost to that overall to the society, which again, if it happens, if we allow cancer to go out, if we allow cancer to go out of control, especially in more rural areas, we have massive economic and social consequences to bear for that.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with that. But you have a strong passion for education and health, and you've been running the Zeribe and Nwosu Foundation, which provides scholarship to a lot of people. So, if you are given now the power and the mantle to recruit the manpower to fight cancer in Africa, Nigeria as let's use Nigeria as our case study now. In Nigeria, what do you think you would do? How do you think you can actually harness the knowledge and the manpower based on the scholarships is given to people out there. How do you think it actually harness this manpower to actually drive cancer research and fight in Africa?
Well, it's interesting. It's an interesting question because actually I got a variant of that question in there was a particular attempt to spotlight me somewhere. I'm not going to mention the specifics, and an aspect of uh, that question, that spotlight was if I was to be given money to recruit experts to work on cancer. That didn't specify Nigeria, but it was just like if I was to be given the resource,
Yeah,
what would I do? Let me answer your question in a variant of it, so to say, which is that I believe that I have already been given the resources to fight cancer in some sense. I've been given the scholarships and the training that brought me this far, and I am in a world-class university doing extraordinary things. And so being able to exercise my mind, that's what I mean by extraordinary things, and being able to exercise my mind to ask questions, have the funding to do some sort of research that I would be unable to do otherwise. And so I've been given, and so maybe the question would have been if I'm to be given more than I already have, what more could I do with it? And so your question is more also then in the direction of Nigeria.
yeah,
Um, and you also sort of tied it to the Zeribe and I scholarship. This is one thing I will tell you about the Zeribe and I scholarship, and then I will answer your question. I have always believed that people should be given the opportunity to study what they want to study.
yeah,
In other words, even if I'm given all the money in the world, I do not think that I will be in a position to force everybody to do cancer research.
yeah,
However, I want to be able to inspire people to do cancer research, and that's not the motivation for the scholarship because a lot of our awardees are engineers or lawyers, and we're not trying to force them to, and we're not going to motivate them in any sense to come to cancer research. We want them to be experts where they are and be good
yeah,
ambassadors of the scholarship wherever they may go. But my hope is that for those who will be interested in cancer research, we have platforms through which we can at least advise them on how to go about it. We can advise them on specific scholarships they can apply to, and we are doing that. We can help them to review their applications. I am in a very good position right now to tell, which is the advantage of having studied in Nigeria, studied in the UK, studied in Germany, and studied now worked and studied and now working in the US. I am in a very good position, really, to recognize very early on a Nigerian biomedical scientist or someone in the biomedical space who has the potential to go even further than I have gone. I can see it because I
yeah,
know the traits that I had at that age, at that stage, and it is really very, very easy for me to recognize that. And so, in my position, if I was to be given more money now to do great things, how do we strengthen the infrastructure back home? How do we provide spaces for people to be able to do some very basic things like cell culture?
yeah,
You know, develop their expertise in that state at that level, develop their passion, and develop their ability to think like scientists. Because what I have found out is that what is important actually is to be able to really ask questions and to have that determination to hold on regardless of obstacles that you of course encounter in your way and along your training stages. And
yeah,
so yeah, how do we provide them the resource to be able to maintain that focus and
yeah,
not get derailed? And so I think that's those are the areas that I'll be investing into more: the resources, providing them the space, the mentorship, and of course resources includes giving people where they merit it, giving them the money to be able to pay themselves out of debts, clearance issues from school, those tiny, tiny things that hold people back, that they
yeah.
can sort it out. That's one of the reasons why we started the scholarship anyway.
Okay. Hmm. Interesting. But I understand that the foundation is not just focused on people in science, but that was just a hypothetical question to see how
Right.
we can actually how you can actually harness that to recruit manpower to fight cancer. But because of time, I'll ask you one more question and then we can round it off. So this is another hypothetical question that I want you to think about as well.
Mm-hmm.
So assuming now we've been talking about cancer disparities. So assuming now you are also tasked again to
Mm-hmm.
lead the policy making committee, all right, comprising of different people from different nationalities
Mm-hmm.
to find ways to reduce cancer health disparities now, okay? What do you think would be the suggestions and recommendations that you make to the committee?
So, well, access to, as we mentioned earlier on, access to resources is very critical. uh, Again, we can preach the message to say let's promote cancer disparity and sorry, let's close the gap in cancer disparity and all of that. But providing the resource is very critical. So my recommendation is going to go more in the direction of providing resource, and actually that has multi dimensions. For a start, if you find somebody who is representative of the other group, the group that is underrepresented, and who has the potentials, and this person is applying for something, how do you evaluate that person? Do you also take into consideration the distance, the challenges that they have overcome, and is there any grace that can be applied to say, okay, well, let's give this person a chance. You understand what I'm saying? Because personally, I
Yeah,
always think about myself as a product of chance. I don't think, I think that if, product of second chance, because I don't think that if I was not being favored in some sense or lucky in some sense, I don't think that I would have gone the far that I went. I mean, I would have come to Cornell. Let's put it this way: I would have come to Cornell anyway. But maybe the path that I have followed to come here would have been a lot more difficult. So
yeah,
I've had people support me, give that mentorship. So that's critical. So I would be advising these people to think about the way we evaluate people. Think about the resources, access. Because again, we're talking about access. If you build a hospital and it is impossible for someone to afford it, they can't access it. If you build a university and it is impossible for some people to get admitted into it, there's no way you continue to alienate those population of people, because you are applying a standard that may be good but it may be unrealistic for at least this set of people. And so we end up in a situation that we look like what we still have, where maybe just one or two of us that are doing this thing, and a
yeah,
lot of others cannot come here because it is just a hard road for them. And by the time they get to this, even if they can make it, by the time they get to this far, they are exhausted, and they don't want to stay. They prefer them to go elsewhere and have a much more comfortable life. So smoothing that pathway by way of providing resource and access and making it easy, providing mentorship, it's a very critical step to making sure that we have more representation in cancer research.
mm, okay. Well, so what?
We can go until yeah, I don't know. Yeah,
That's
we
fine,
can go until 11 o'clock. But I have a seminar here afterwards.
yeah,
Yeah. So
but
if you wanted to ask question, go ahead.
yeah, but that's fine. But so one can say that everything should be about making should be about making cancer care and accessible and affordable to the patients, isn't it?
It is a very significant part of it. It is extremely important that the patients have access to it, to cancer care. Because otherwise, if we're even talking about collecting samples for molecular profiling, how are we going to accomplish that? You need that. I mean, it's, at some point, we have to stop and recognize how important the patients are in our
Mm,
effort to understand cancer. In fact, putting another way, we can't understand cancer without the patients.
yeah.
right? And so if you don't make it easy for patients to be able to come to hospital, and if you don't make also the process of consenting and everything easy, if in some instance you have the patients can come to us, but you have some institutions where maybe they are complicated, impossible odds, that by the time you subject the patient to that, all of that, they're not going to consent. They won't
Yeah.
consent. Patient that especially, and there's this another point that also probably maybe some people in the Western world may not easily appreciate. For those of us who have come from very rural areas, we also have cultural issues in the context of, I. Why should you give your son? What is going to be made of it? You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So we have sometimes some traditional beliefs. Let me use the word traditional because that makes it easy for anybody from my space to understand what I mean. Traditional beliefs, that to some extent you should not give your, resource in that sense, for what you don't know what it will be used for later on. And so these are all issues too, that somehow needs to be taken into cognizance, especially by those who maybe formulate those clinical trials, or those who have to seek patients' consent, and to make it easy overall for us to be able to access that vital resource we need to be able to understand cancer.
Hmm. That's interesting. But um, but just to summarize, because of time. So, what the thing is, I think it has to be said that people need to understand that cancer is a global problem. It's a
Yes,
global problem. It affects everyone,
yes.
both the old and the young, the different ages, different ethnic groups,
No
everybody.
discrimination.
No, no discrimination. But it's also important that all hands are on deck to actually fight cancer, since we can see that there are disparities that are actually limiting the access of some people from different in this demographic that we're looking at today to
Mhm.
cancer care. So we have to find a way to make sure that cancer care gets to them, is accessible, is affordable, and so that
Right.
people can actually get the treatment they actually need at the right time.
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so there is one thing that, let me just in a few seconds, let me just say this. There's something that actually, was it yesterday? I believe it's yesterday. I began to think about this a bit. I've thought about it for a while in the past, but somehow it left my radar. But it came back somehow yesterday, and that is uh, what happened with COVID versus what has happened, or what is happening with cancer. Why was COVID? Why was it easy for us to track down COVID very quickly? And why has it been difficult for us to track down cancer? And that's what a question I was asking myself. And I began to think that the difference is very likely in the fact that COVID, although underwent some mutations in the period of time that it was being treated, uh, was not as heterogeneous. And I'm not talking about the complications of COVID, but I'm talking about the virus itself. Was
Yeah.
not as heterogeneous as cancer, which in many instances is not just one entity, even in the same patient, maybe rather a constellation of so many molecular subtypes being bunched together. And so it seems to me that maybe we should begin to think about elephant approach, eating elephant, what I call uh, uh, approach to eating an elephant, which is, to kind of break down that molecular subtype, portrait and subtypes into chunks, and just think of what works for one molecular subtype, what works for another molecular subtype, and then begin to think of how we can really find drugs that can work for all of these subtypes, even in one patient. So that even means that you have one patient that has a particular tumor, then you take that tumor and look at that tumor as, let's say, 10 tumors,
Mm.
depending on how many molecular subtypes that it is harboring as a mass, right? And then think of what treatment will work for each of these subtypes, and then think of how you could find one universal treatment that is going to hit those multiple subtypes at the same time. I was just fascinating about this idea yesterday, and I think it is probably worth digging into a little bit more. But I want to end by saying, at least from my side, that I have uh, always been optimistic, and I will be, that cancer will be solved.
Yeah.
Yeah, it will be solved. I'm not sure how long, but we will find solution to it. And
Yeah.
I hope that many other people also share in this optimism.
Yeah, I agree with that. We have to actually at least hold on to the hope that we'll find the cure. Because once you lose hope, that's it. Like you said, we found it easy to solve COVID, maybe because of how rapid the response was before the mutations could get worse. We find it so easy to actually eradicate COVID, and maybe because there was no genetic alterations in different ethnic groups that made it even harder to actually treat COVID. Maybe I'm not sure, so maybe that's why it was even easier. But anyway, because of time, that's all the time we have for this week. Thank you, Dr. Zeribe, for the time, and thank you for your insight on cancer research. This is really, really, really helpful and thoughtful. Thank you for
Thank,
your time.
thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much.
So, what do you think generally now about your first podcast now that you've done it?
Very exciting. I just feel like I should do another one next week. Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
well, everybody says that. So, but over time, in the future, we'll have time to do more and more episodes.
Yes, yes, there are many things to talk about. I'm also very interested in education, as you already know.
Yeah,
Different issues in the educational sector, and I'm just thinking about how we could potentially help to at least um raise the standard. And I'm very happy to talk about some of the perspectives that I have also in that direction, or that I have
definitely.
formed over the years in that direction.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. We'll plan that so that maybe in the next season, so we'll have more and more talks and more episodes on that.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.